Hello, we want to welcome you to our small group Thrive edition, and we just want to welcome you here today, and we are thankful that you've chosen to journey along with us. And so today we're going to be unpacking Daniel chapter 1 as we spend some time just kind of worshiping. I want us to just kind of draw our attention to an interesting verse, and the very, very quick Reader's Digest backstory is that God's chosen people, the Israelites, have been disobedient, and so God has allowed a pagan king to come in and to take over the country as discipline. And so when the Babylonians took over a country, they would take some of the best men and they would place them in kind of a Babylonian immersion school, and where they would essentially just kind of retrain their thinking into Babylonian law and to use them to strengthen their forces. And so they captured Daniel and they captured some of his friends, and they took him to a totally foreign, totally pagan, totally opposite culture to what they believed about the true God kind of culture. And everything was designed in Babylon to kind of beat out, squish out, and somehow get rid of what they used to believe back home. And they were very clear, and there was incredible pressure to conform to what was okay in Babylon. And so we get to verse 8, and the boys were assigned a portion of the kids' food, and it says that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. And so defiled is kind of a strange word. It's kind of a strong word. It really just honestly means just to make impure, to make rotten, to make vile, to make disgusting. So it's pretty strong language. And in the Old Testament, God gave his people very specific dietary laws, and there were some things that they could eat and there were some things that they couldn't. Some of the king's food would make Daniel spiritually impure and disobedient to the Lord if he was to eat it. And so here lies Daniel's adversity. Daniel has a choice to make. He's got a choice right in this moment to break God's standard by eating the food, or to starve, or to face the serious consequences of what could be coming. And so Daniel made a choice. He basically said, Lord, I belong to you. I am going to live by your principles. I am going to live by your standards, and I really don't care what it costs me. And even if it costs me my life, no matter what, Lord, I am going to live for you. And I don't care who knows. I'm going to establish my life on your agenda and on your principles and on your standards, and I will declare to anyone that will listen that I will live by those things, and even in spite of what it may cost me. He just kind of said, God, I belong to you, and to you I say yes. I say yes to living for you regardless of the cost. And so as we worship today, may these words just be a declaration in our spirits to obey and to follow the Lord as we prepare our hearts for what he would have for us today. So let's worship together. Count on one thing, the same God that never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out. You're working all things out. Yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy in all my days. Oh, yes, I will. Count on one thing, the same God who never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out. You're working all things out. lowest valley, and yes, I will bless your name, and yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy in all my days. Oh yes, I will for all my days. Oh yes, I will, and I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, and nothing can stand against. I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, and nothing can stand against. I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, that nothing can stand against. I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, that nothing can stand against. Oh, and yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley, and yes, I will bless your name. Yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy in all my days. Yes, I will. I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, and nothing can stand against. I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, and nothing can stand against. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name, and yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy in all my days. Yes, I will for all my days. Yes, I will for all my days. Yes, I will.
Well, welcome. We are so glad that you joined us tonight and on our first of this small group podcast, whatever you might want to call it, our gathering time. And we are tying this into Sunday morning, where we have been talking about thriving in uncertain times and looking at the book of Daniel. And the first chapter of Daniel is really about adversity. It really sets out the setting of all the adversity that these guys faced. And we want to talk about that tonight, and you will in your small groups talk about it as well. But what John and I want to just highlight or talk a little bit about is, what are some of the causes? Like what are some of the frameworks for thinking about adversity?
Well, I think one of the things that comes to mind when you think about adversity, and in my life, some of the times I've faced it, is sometimes adversity comes because of things that I have done. Mm. It happens because of me, whether it's mistakes I've made or things I've done, and then you find that adversity comes. And it's very important to understand when it's my fault that the adversity is coming.
You always got to start with a hard one, though.
Oh,
yeah,
of course.
Because those are tough ones to accept.
It is, because when the adversity happens because of me, it means there's something in me that has to change, and I have to be willing to make that change for the adversity to go away. I remember when I was in Bible school, and this may seem like a small thing or a trite thing, but it was a lesson that I learned that stood me well later on in life and ministry. I played for a hockey team, a Christian hockey team in the church rec league. And you know how sometimes church rec leagues can be quite interesting.
Yes.
And I remember there was a time in my second season, and I would take a penalty and I would just gripe to the refs. The refs began to not like me because I would always complain. And it was just bad. And I remember it reached a point where the captain of the team who ran the team came to me one day and said, "John, if you continue this, I'm going to kick you off the team." And so it was very easy. This is me. This is something I need to change. I recognized that. And I wanted to play on the team because I enjoyed playing. I enjoyed the camaraderie. And so for the rest of the year, I kept my mouth shut because I knew if I opened my mouth up and complained to the ref that I would be kicked off the team. So the rest of the year, I just did what I was told. I took my penalties and kept quiet. The next year, I found that I didn't get as many penalty calls. I found that the refs were better with me because I was leaving them alone. And again, it may seem like a minor thing, but I recognized that the adversity was coming because of me. And I needed to change, and I made that change. A couple of years later, I was the president of the league and working with the referees, and they were happy that I had changed because the relationship was much, much better. So the adversity was because of me. And when I recognized that and was able to change, then my circumstances changed.
I'll take a much safer one. This is one that we like too, I think of life circumstances. Like life happens, and sometimes it just hits us with different things. And I remember in my own life, it was in my late 30s, early 40s, that I just went through, it just seemed like a series after series of health issues. Like I had, appendicitis. It took them a while to recognize what it was, and then I had 3 bouts with kidney stones, and I had a ruptured belly button, and then I had cataracts, and they did surgery to put in the lens implants, and then I had a partially detached retina, and this was like all over a span of 4 or 5 years. And I remember feeling like, what is going on with me? Like I had kind of pictured myself as somewhat athletic and felt like I was, healthy and strong and done sports. And then all of a sudden these things just crept in. And I remember sitting in the hospital bed at one point, and one of the thoughts was, whatever I'm doing for self-care isn't working. Quit fooling yourself. That was one of the thoughts. But the other one was, I had to come to grips with the fact that God, what are you teaching me in this? Like, what is it that you're teaching me? And one of the things several things, was that I came to grips with the fact of compassion. I suddenly had a compassion for things that people were going through that I guess before I knew in my head to be, oh, that's too bad. But now I could picture what it was like to be going through this series of health things and not knowing exactly how it's going to turn out. I think one of the other things that really I learned in that time was the value of community, of having people that, what it meant to have people say, really praying for me, that would be encouraging, and that just coming alongside. Man, I learned to love the church and the community of the church in that time, because it was a sense of support through that. And then I think just even one of the other things was it did an awful lot for me to lean into God, where, before it was kind of, you had this a little bit maybe foolish thought of being somewhat invincible to some of that, and suddenly I realized, every breath, every day is a gift of God, and everything is dependent on His grace. And I learned far more to recognize my dependence upon Him. So life circumstances, they all happen to all of us, and it is a time when we really have to come to grips with some thoughts and the way we perceive it, like James chapter 1 verse 2 that says, consider hardship Sorry, let me read it properly. Dear brothers and sisters, whenever trouble comes your way, let it be an opportunity for joy. For when your joy is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. But that learning to see circumstances in the proper way.
Mm-hmm. That bit, the part of leaning in on God, I think is really, really important, especially when you think of the next one. Because sometimes adversity comes because of the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about the fact that we battle, not against just flesh and blood, but against principalities and power. And we need to recognize that the enemy is out there, and the enemy seeks to cause us to lose our faith. And there are times when adversity comes from the enemy, and we really need to learn to rely on God. Early on in our ministry, it was actually the first church that we really pastored full time. We ran into that about a year and a half in to our ministry. There was a person who it was like one day the light switch went out, and they went from being a really good friend to my wife and spending time with them to pretty much hating my guts overnight.
Wow.
And it was like a light switch went out from one day to the next. It was an instantaneous, it was a blind side. We just really didn't know how to respond. It was very, very hard. And we just had to recognize that there was a spiritual battle going on. And I remember when I was interning very young in our ministry as a youth pastor in Weyburn, I remember watching the senior pastor face attacks that came through people but from the enemy. And it stood us well in this instance because him and his wife had tremendous grace, and they would just weather the storm and say, God will take care of it. It's in God's hands. If it's from the enemy, there's not much we can do, and God will take care of it in due time. And when we went through this, we had to recognize that it was from the enemy. It wasn't something that we could battle on our own. It wasn't something that we necessarily could change, or it wasn't just a regular life circumstance. And so we did have to rely on God and learn. Sometimes you have to learn not to fight back. From my past and my experience being, some people remember and probably have heard of the abuse I faced when I was a young child and through my preteen years. And I tend to be a fighter and want to fight back and be proactive, and sometimes you just can't. And we need to recognize that, in that circumstance, in the end, the church closed in that circumstance. It took a couple of years, and we ended up staying probably a year longer than we really wanted to, but we both recognized that God wanted us to stay. And we worked through it, we hope, with grace and with dignity and our integrity intact, because we did not respond in kind to what was being done in that attack against us. And we had to recognize that there was a bigger picture there. It wasn't just about us. It was about the church and the community and God himself. And we had to let God take care of that. And so when the enemy does attack us, we have to recognize that where it's from, and recognize that it is the enemy, and fall back on God and rely on him, because we can't win those battles on our own. I remember one verse that became very, very important to us in the midst of this is 2 Peter.
Kind of your life verse.
My life verse, and you've heard it here over the years many times. As we know Jesus better, his divine power gives us everything we need for living a godly life. And he's called us to receive his own glory and goodness, and by that same mighty power, he has given us all his rich and wonderful promises. And sometimes we just need to stand on those promises and let him fight that battle for us against the enemy, because we can't do it on our own.
Wow. And this is one of the things that makes it even difficult, is because there's a converse on that too, is sometimes, and I spoke about this on Sunday, is sometimes adversity is sent by God. Like there's those things where I talked about on Sunday, God sent them into exile, or this puzzling phrase in Matthew chapter 4 where it says, then Jesus was led out into the wilderness by the Holy Spirit to be tempted there by the devil, and that whole idea that sometimes God brings in difficulties and adversity into our life to sometimes inspect us, sometimes to perfect us, sometimes to work in us, but there's also that aspect of where God is at work. He's not into this for our comfort, but he's into this for our growth and our developing maturity and holiness. So the big question all of this is sometimes leads us to is like, how do you discern? Like if it's life circumstances, you kind of like, well, you can kind of blame it on life circumstances. But if it's me, it's not healthy to blame it on something else because nothing changes.
That's right.
You know? And so that's maybe a great discussion for you and your small group this afterwards here, is to talk about that. You know, what are some of the adversities that you've faced? Because recognizing the source, recognizing that where that adversity is, plays a big factor in how we respond to it. And so maybe that's a great discussion, is to share some of the adversities you've faced in your life and talk about how have you dealt with some of those adversities. John and I have just shared very briefly, we would not by any means say that what we've given you today is exhaustive of how you deal with adversity. There's probably much wisdom in the room when you share with each other some of the things that you could share. But we just want to bless you in your time together. This is, I think, just a great time for you to be able to share. This is a topic all of us are aware of. There's not very many people that ever go through life that have not faced adversity. And so we can all relate to this topic, and we all have something to bring to it. And we just want to trust that you have a great time in your small groups tonight.